It was a regular Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day where nothing special happens. David was sitting in his home office typing away on his laptop, working on lecture notes for his upcoming class. He was a law professor at a university in Washington, D.C., specializing in constitutional law. His wife, Jennifer, had just gotten home from her night shift at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. She was upstairs, probably already asleep after a long 12 hours on her feet. The house was quiet. Their 2 kids were at school. David was lost in his work, thinking about how to explain a complicated legal concept to his students in a way they'd actually understand. That's when everything changed in an instant. The front door didn't just open. It exploded inward with a deafening crash that made David jump out of his chair. His heart started pounding as 4 men in regular clothes burst into his house, guns drawn, screaming at the top of their lungs. For a split second, David thought they were being robbed. His mind raced through possibilities. Home invasion? Wrong house? What was happening? Then he saw the badges clipped to their belts. Police officers. But why were they breaking down his door? David's legal training kicked in almost automatically, cutting through the panic. He raised his hand slowly, making sure they could see he wasn't a threat. His voice came out steadier than he felt. "Can I see your warrant, please?" The lead officer, a tall man with graying hair and a permanent scowl, didn't even look at him properly. He just waved his hand dismissively, like David had asked a stupid question. "We don't need a warrant. We have probable cause. Anonymous tip about illegal weapons in this residence." David felt his blood run cold, but not from fear, from anger. He knew the law inside and out. This wasn't how things were supposed to work. "That's not how probable cause works, officer. You still need a warrant unless there are exigent circumstances." "Is someone's life in danger right now?" The officer's scowl deepened. "Don't tell me how to do my job, sir. Step aside." Upstairs, Jennifer had woken up to the commotion. David heard her footsteps rushing down the stairs, and then her voice, high with panic. "What's going on, David?" "What's happening?" She appeared at the bottom of the staircase in her pajamas, hair messy from sleep, eyes wide with confusion and fear. One of the officers immediately moved toward her, telling her to stay where she was and keep her hands visible. Jennifer looked at David, terrified, and he tried to give her a reassuring look even though his own heart was hammering in his chest. The officers spread out through the house like they owned the place. David watched in disbelief as they started tearing through his home. They yanked books off shelves, sending them crashing to the floor. They pulled out every drawer in the kitchen, dumping contents everywhere. They flipped over couch cushions. They weren't being careful or respectful. They were destructive, like they wanted to make a point. David followed the lead officer, keeping his voice calm but firm. "You're violating our Fourth Amendment rights. You have no warrant, no exigent circumstances, and from what you've said, no real probable cause. An anonymous tip isn't enough." The officer, whose name tag read Detective Reeves, turned to face him with an expression that was almost amused. "You a lawyer or something?" "I'm a constitutional law professor, actually. I've taught Fourth Amendment law for 15 years. Detective Reeves actually laughed at that. It wasn't a friendly laugh. It was the kind of laugh that said he didn't care. "Oh, great. Another lawyer who thinks he knows better than cops who actually work the streets. You people live in your ivory towers teaching theory. We deal with reality." David felt Jennifer move closer to him. She was shaking slightly, and he wanted to comfort her. But he couldn't take his eyes off what was happening to their home. An officer in the dining room had just swept their wedding photos off the table, glass frames shattering on the hardwood floor. "Reality includes the Constitution," David said, still keeping his tone professional despite his rising anger. "You're supposed to uphold it, not ignore it." Detective Reeves stepped closer, clearly trying to intimidate him. "You want to tell me how to do my job? Maybe you want to obstruct a police investigation? Because I can arrest you for that right now." This was the moment David knew he was dealing with officers who either didn't know the law or didn't care about it, possibly both. He'd seen this before in his work, read about it in cases, even testified as an expert witness about it. But experiencing it in his own home, with his wife frightened beside him and his children's rooms being ransacked upstairs, was entirely different. "Obstruction requires that I physically interfere with your duties or encourage others to resist arrest," David said calmly. "Asking to see a warrant and informing you of constitutional violations is protected speech. And you know that, or you should," another officer called out from the bedroom. Nothing up here, Detective. Detective Reeves's jaw tightened. They weren't finding what they'd come for because there was nothing to find. David owned exactly one firearm, a hunting rifle that had belonged to his father. It was properly registered, locked in a gun safe in the basement, exactly where it was supposed to be according to local laws. What the officers didn't know, and what David hadn't mentioned yet, was who he really was beyond just a law professor. He'd spent 12 years before teaching as a senior attorney with a major civil rights organization. He'd sued police departments in 7 different states for constitutional violations. He'd won most of those cases. He'd argued in front of appeals courts and had even been part of a legal team that took a case to the Supreme Court. He'd dedicated his entire career to defending the exact rights that were being trampled in his living room right now. David slowly reached for his phone in his pocket, moving deliberately so no one would think he was reaching for a weapon. Detective Reeves's hand moved to his gun, but David held up the phone where everyone could see it. "I'm going to record this now. That's also my legal right." "Put that away," Detective Reeves ordered. "No," David said simply. "There's no law against recording police officers performing their duties in my own home." He activated the recording app and began speaking clearly into the phone, documenting everything. Badge numbers, names, the damage to his property, the lack of a warrant. Every statement the officers made. Jennifer, seeing what he was doing and understanding, pulled out her own phone and did the same. Detective Reeves's face was turning red now. The other officers had stopped searching and were watching the confrontation. They looked uncomfortable, like maybe they were starting to realize this wasn't going the way it was supposed to. "We're done here," Detective Reeves finally said. "But you haven't heard the last of this." David smiled for the first time since they'd burst in. It wasn't a happy smile. "You're absolutely right about that, Detective. You haven't heard the last of this at all." What Detective Reeves didn't know was that David's home security system had been recording everything from multiple angles since the moment the door was breached. What he didn't know was that the footage was already uploaded to a cloud server, time-stamped and preserved. What he didn't know was that David had already sent a quick text to 3 of his colleagues, 2 of whom were federal judges, letting them know what was happening. And what Detective Reeves definitely didn't know was that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his career by walking into the home of someone who not only knew every single constitutional protection inside and out, but who had spent years fighting to protect those rights for others. As the officers filed out of his destroyed home, leaving the front door hanging on broken hinges, David looked at Jennifer. She was crying now, the shock wearing off and the violation of their space hitting her fully. He put his arm around her. "Are we safe?" she whispered. David looked at the wreckage of their living room, at the broken picture frames and scattered belongings, at the door that would need to be replaced. Then he looked at his phone, still recording, and at the tiny red light on the security camera in the corner. "We're safe," he said. "And now we make sure this never happens to anyone else." The silence after the officers left was somehow worse than the chaos of the raid itself. David and Jennifer stood in their destroyed living room, surrounded by the wreckage of their peaceful life. Books everywhere, broken glass crunching under their feet, the front door barely hanging on, letting in cold air from outside. Jennifer was the first to move. She walked to the couch, pushed the displaced cushions aside, and sat down heavily. Her hands were still shaking. "What just happened, David? Why did they do this to us?" David was already reviewing the video on his phone, his legal mind working through everything even as his emotions churned beneath the surface. "They thought they could intimidate us. They thought we'd be too scared or too ignorant to fight back. Can they really just break into our house like that?" "No," David said firmly. "They absolutely cannot. What they did was illegal. Every single part of it." He sat down next to her and took her hand. It was cold. She'd been asleep 15 minutes ago, enjoying a few hours of rest after a brutal night shift. Now she was sitting in their ransacked home, trying to process a violation that most people never experience. "I need to call a locksmith for the door," Jennifer said, her nurse's practicality kicking in even through the shock. "And we need to clean this up before the kids get home from school. They can't see the house like this." David nodded, but his mind was already 3 steps ahead. "We'll handle all of that. But first I need to make some calls. Important ones." He pulled up his contacts and started with Robert Chen, a colleague who taught administrative law. Robert answered on the second ring. David, I got your text. Are you and Jennifer okay? Physically, yes. Legally, I'm about to make someone's life very complicated. David walked Robert through everything that had happened, speaking in the precise language of someone who documented thousands of cases. Robert listened, asking sharp questions, and by the end of the conversation, he'd agreed to serve as a witness to David's contemporaneous account of events. Next, David called Amanda Rodriguez, a federal judge he'd worked with years ago when she'd been a civil rights attorney. She was in court, but she called him back within 20 minutes. When he told her what happened, there was a long pause on the line. David, I'm going to ask you this once, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Is everything you just told me accurate? Every word. And I have video evidence of all of it. Another pause. Then Amanda's voice came back harder than before. Send me everything. I can't get involved directly because of my position, but I know people at the Justice Department who need to see this. This isn't just about you. If they did this to a law professor who knows his rights, imagine what they're doing to people who don't. That thought had already occurred to David. It made him angrier than his own violation did. By the time the locksmith arrived, David had made 6 more calls. He'd contacted the city's civilian complaint board, though he had little faith they'd do anything meaningful. He'd left a message with a journalist he knew at the local newspaper, who covered police accountability issues. He'd even reached out to his former colleagues at the civil rights organization, where he'd worked before teaching. Jennifer had been busy too. She'd swept up the broken glass, straightened furniture, and tried to restore some sense of order to their home. But when their daughter Rachel and son Tyler walked through the newly installed door after school, they knew immediately something was wrong. "Why is there a new lock on the door?" Rachel asked. She was 16, sharp and observant. "And why does the house look weird?" David and Jennifer exchanged a glance. They decided to be honest with their kids. At their ages, they deserved the truth. "Something happened today while you were at school," David began. "Some police officers came to our house without permission and without a warrant. They made a mess, but everyone's safe and we're handling it." Tyler, who was 14 and had inherited his father's questioning nature, immediately asked, "Can they do that? Just come into our house?" "No, they can't," David said, "and that's why I'm going to do something about it." That evening, after the kids were in bed and Jennifer had finally stopped moving long enough to sit down, David opened his laptop at the kitchen table. The house was quiet again, but it felt different now. Less safe, more fragile. "What are you doing?" Jennifer asked, bringing him coffee. "I'm filing a lawsuit." Jennifer sat down across from him. "Against the police?" "Against the officers individually, the police department and the city. All of them." His fingers were already flying across the keyboard. "What they did today violated the 4th Amendment, which protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. It violated our 14th Amendment rights to due process. They destroyed our property. They caused emotional distress. And they did it all with a smugness that tells me this wasn't their first time. Will anything actually happen to them?" Jennifer's voice was small. "I mean, we always hear about police getting away with things." David looked up from his laptop. "Usually, yes, because most victims can't afford to fight back. They don't have the knowledge or resources or time. They settle for small payouts and nothing changes. But I'm not most victims, Jennifer. This is literally what I do. I know every case, every precedent, every legal strategy, and I'm not stopping until something changes." He worked through the night drafting a legal complaint that was more than just a document. It was a weapon, carefully crafted and precisely aimed. He cited case after case, building an argument that was airtight. He documented every constitutional violation with the kind of detail that made it impossible to dismiss. By morning, the complaint was 37 pages long. David sent it to 3 attorney friends for review. All 3 called him back within hours, and they all said essentially the same thing. It was devastating, airtight, the kind of legal filing that makes defendants nervous the moment they see it. But David wasn't done. He spent the next day gathering more evidence. He pulled the complete security footage from his home system. 6 different camera angles, all showing the officers breaking down the door, searching without authorization, dismissing his requests for a warrant. He uploaded it all to multiple secure cloud servers, making copies that couldn't be destroyed or lost. Then he did something that would prove crucial later. He filed a public records request with the police department. He wanted everything. The original complaint that led to the raid, any reports filed by the officers, body camera footage if it existed, communications about the raid, and any internal policies regarding warrantless searches. The department had 30 days to respond. David suspected they'd stall, but that was fine. Delays would only look worse for them later. 3 days after the raid, David's complaint was filed in federal court. He held a press conference on the courthouse steps, something he'd normally never do. But this wasn't about ego or publicity. It was about making sure everyone knew what had happened and why it mattered. The local news cameras were there. The journalist he'd contacted had written a story that morning, and it had spread quickly on social media. People were angry. They wanted answers. David stood at a microphone, Jennifer beside him, and spoke clearly. 3 days ago, 4 police officers broke down my door without a warrant, without probable cause, and without any legal justification. They destroyed my home, terrorized my family, and violated our constitutional rights. I'm a law professor. I know my rights. I can fight back. But I keep thinking about all the people who can't. All the families who've experienced the same thing, but didn't have the knowledge or resources to seek justice. This lawsuit isn't just about my family. It's about making sure this doesn't keep happening. A reporter shouted a question. What do you want to happen to the officers? David didn't hesitate. I want accountability. I want them to face consequences for breaking the law they're supposed to uphold. And I want the system that allowed this to happen to change. That evening, the police union released a statement defending the officers. They claimed David was anti-police and was using his position to attack law enforcement. They said the raid was by the book and proper procedure had been followed. David read the statement and actually smiled. They were lying and he could prove it. Better yet, their public defense of the indefensible would only make his case stronger. He opened his laptop again and started drafting his response. The fight was just beginning, and David was exactly where he wanted to be. In a battle he knew how to win, armed with evidence and law, fighting for something that mattered more than just his own violated privacy. He was fighting for a principle. And principles he'd learned long ago were worth whatever it took to defend them. Jennifer came downstairs and found him still working at 2 a.m. Come to bed, she said softly. Soon, David promised. I just need to finish this. She looked at her husband, hunched over his laptop in their kitchen, and realized something. The officers had broken into their house hoping to find a criminal. Instead, they'd awakened something far more dangerous to them. A man who knew exactly how to fight back and wouldn't stop until justice was served. The lawsuit hit the police department like a bomb. Within 24 hours of David filing his complaint, the story wasn't just local news anymore. National media picked it up. Cable news channels discussed it. Social media exploded with opinions from every direction. The police department's initial response was predictable. Police Chief Harold Martinez held his own press conference, standing behind a podium with the city's seal on it, flanked by union representatives. His statement was carefully worded, probably written by the city's lawyers. The officers involved in this incident followed proper procedures based on credible intelligence regarding illegal firearms. The chief said, his voice firm and confident, "We stand by our officers and their actions. Mr. Bennett is entitled to his day in court, but we're confident that the facts will show our officers acted appropriately." David watched the press conference from his office at the university. One of his students had sent him the link. He watched the chief speak with that absolute certainty, that unwavering confidence, and he thought about what he knew that the chief apparently didn't. The lies were about to unravel. 2 weeks after filing the lawsuit, David's attorney, a sharp woman named Lisa Park who specialized in civil rights cases, received the response to their public records request. It came in a large box, hundreds of pages that the department probably hoped no one would actually read carefully. Lisa called David immediately. "You need to see this. Can you come to my office?" David arrived within an hour. Lisa had papers spread across her entire conference table, organized into different piles. She looked excited in the way lawyers get when they find something good. "Really good. Tell me you found something," David said. "I found everything." Lisa picked up a thin file from one pile. "This is the original complaint that supposedly justified the raid on your house. Want to know who filed it? Anonymous tip, according to Detective Reeves." "Not exactly anonymous." They have a name. Kevin Larson. Ring any bells? David's eyes widened. Kevin Larson failed my constitutional law class 2 years ago. He accused me of grading him unfairly and filed a complaint with the university. The complaint was dismissed because he'd barely attended class and failed every exam. Lisa smiled. Well, Mr. Larson apparently told police that you had illegal automatic weapons and were planning something dangerous. The report doesn't say what. It's incredibly vague. Any reasonable officer should have questioned it, but they didn't question it. They didn't even try to verify it. Lisa picked up another document. Here's where it gets really interesting. This is Detective Reeves' service record. 3 formal complaints in the last 4 years for questionable searches. All 3 complaints were filed by minority residents in the Eastern District. All 3 were dismissed after internal review. David felt a cold anger settling in his chest. They buried them. They absolutely buried them. The complaints never went anywhere, because the internal affairs investigators determined the searches were justified. But look at this. Lisa spread out 3 incident reports. In all 3 cases, Detective Reeves claimed he had credible anonymous tips about illegal activity. In all 3 cases, nothing significant was found. In 2 of the cases, the homes belonged to people with prior arrests, which he probably used to justify the searches after the fact. He has a pattern, David said quietly. He has a clear pattern of violating Fourth Amendment rights and getting away with it. Lisa picked up another stack. And here's the really damning part. I found internal emails between Detective Reeves and his supervisor from 6 months ago. The supervisor, a Lieutenant Collins, was questioning Reeves about his search protocols. Reeves responded, and I quote, "We can't let paperwork and legal technicalities prevent us from doing our jobs. Sometimes you have to act first and justify later." David read the email himself. There it was in black and white. A police officer admitting he didn't care about constitutional protections, admitting he fabricated justifications after the fact. Can we use this in court? David asked. Absolutely. And it gets better. I contacted the 3 people who filed complaints against Reeves. 2 of them are willing to talk. They want to join the lawsuit. Over the next month, David's case transformed from a single incident into something much larger. 2 more plaintiffs joined. Gregory Williams, a mechanic whose home had been raided 2 years earlier, and Patricia Johnson, a retired teacher whose apartment had been searched 18 months ago. Both were black. Both had been accused based on vague anonymous tips. Both had found nothing but legal items in their homes. Both had been too intimidated or too poor to fight back at the time. The pattern was undeniable now. Detective Reeves targeted people he thought wouldn't or couldn't fight back. People without resources, without legal knowledge, without connections. He'd made one critical mistake. He'd targeted David, who had all 3. The media attention intensified. Civil rights organizations that David had worked with years ago reached out, offering support. The local NACP chapter held a rally. Community leaders started speaking out about their own experiences with aggressive policing. The city tried to contain the damage. They offered David a settlement, a quiet one, with a confidentiality agreement. $200,000 to make the whole thing go away. Jennifer was in the room when Lisa presented the offer. She looked at David with an expression he couldn't quite read. "That's a lot of money," she said carefully. "It is," David agreed. "But you're not going to take it." "No, I'm not." Lisa wasn't surprised. "I told them you'd probably refuse. They've authorized me to go higher if needed, maybe as high as $500,000. David shook his head. "This isn't about money. If I take a settlement with a confidentiality clause, nothing changes. Detective Reeves keeps his job. The department keeps operating the same way. And the next person whose door they break down won't have any precedent to point to, any public record to reference. It all stays buried." Jennifer reached over and squeezed his hand. She'd been quiet since the raid, processing the trauma in her own way. But now she spoke up. "I was angry at first that you were pushing this so hard. I just wanted everything to go back to normal. But I was talking to one of my patients last week, an older woman from the East Side. She told me police broke into her grandson's apartment last year, tore the place apart, found nothing. The kid was so traumatized he moved out of state. She said they never thought they could do anything about it because that's just how things are." She looked at David with tears in her eyes. "I don't want that to be how things are. Not anymore." 3 weeks later, the Department of Justice announced they were opening an investigation into the police department's search and seizure practices. The announcement didn't mention David's case specifically, but everyone knew it was connected. Federal investigators started reviewing years of records looking for patterns. Detective Reeves was placed on administrative leave, so were two of the other officers who'd participated in the raid. The police union screamed about due process, about officers being presumed guilty, about anti-police bias. The irony wasn't lost on David. Due process and presumption of innocence were exactly what Reeves had denied him and countless others. The city's mayor, a pragmatic woman named Patricia Thornton who was up for re-election, started feeling the heat. Community groups were demanding answers. The Justice Department investigation was front-page news. Her opponent in the upcoming election was using the scandal against her, claiming she'd failed to oversee the police department properly. Mayor Thornton called a meeting with her city attorney, the police chief, and several advisors. David knew about the meeting because one of the advisors was a former student of his who quietly let him know what was being discussed. They were panicking. The case was becoming too big, too public, and too damaging. At the university, David's students treated him differently now. Some looked at him like he was a hero. Others seemed nervous, like his fight with the police department made him dangerous to be associated with. One student, a young man named Chris who wanted to be a prosecutor, stayed after class one day. "Professor Bennett, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you think what you're doing will actually change anything? I mean, police departments have been sued before. Things stay pretty much the same." David considered the question carefully. "You're right that lawsuits alone don't always create lasting change, but they can be part of a larger movement toward accountability. Every time someone stands up and says this is wrong, it gets a little harder for the system to ignore the problem. Change is slow, Chris, but it starts with people refusing to accept injustice as normal." That night, David received an email that changed everything. It was from an officer in Detective Reeves's unit, sent from an anonymous email account. The officer didn't identify himself, but he attached documents. Lots of them. Internal communications showing that supervisors knew about Reeves's questionable tactics. Reports that had been altered after the fact to make searches seem more justified. A spreadsheet tracking anonymous tips that showed a suspicious pattern of convenient timing. And most damning of all, text messages between Reeves and another officer joking about constitutional crybabies and how to CYA on searches. David forwarded everything to Lisa immediately, then called her. "This is explosive," Lisa said after reviewing the files. "If this is authentic, and I believe it is, this shows systematic knowledge and cover-up at multiple levels. This isn't just a few bad officers anymore. This is institutional. Can we verify it's real? The metadata looks legitimate, and we can cross-reference these documents with other records we've obtained. But David, whoever sent this is taking a huge risk. They're essentially whistleblowing against their own department. Maybe they're tired of being part of something corrupt," David said. "Maybe they want it to change too." The next morning, David woke up to his phone buzzing constantly. News trucks were parked outside his house. The story had leaked. Someone, possibly the same whistleblower, had sent similar documents to the press. The headline on every major news site read some variation of the same thing.
"Documents reveal systematic civil rights violations in city police department. The walls were closing in."
And David, standing in his kitchen watching the news vans outside, knew that everything was about to change. Not just for him, but for everyone who'd been too afraid or too powerless to fight back. Justice, he thought, might actually be possible. But the fight was far from over. The leaked documents changed everything overnight. What had started as one law professor fighting back against a bad raid suddenly became a full-blown scandal that nobody could ignore. The city was in crisis mode and everyone knew it. David's phone didn't stop ringing for 3 days straight. Journalists wanted interviews. Other victims wanted to share their stories. Lawyers from across the country called offering help. His email inbox was flooded with messages from people thanking him, supporting him, or sometimes criticizing him for attacking the police. But the most important call came from someone he'd never met. Her name was Vanessa Wright, and she worked in the police department's internal affairs division. She didn't call his cell phone. She called his office at the university, late on a Thursday evening when most people had gone home. "Professor Bennett, I need to talk to you, but not on the phone. Can we meet somewhere private?" They met at a small coffee shop 40 minutes outside the city, the kind of place where nobody would recognize either of them. Vanessa was younger than David expected, maybe 35, with tired eyes that had seen too much. She sat down across from him and didn't waste time. "I've worked in internal affairs for 6 years. I've reviewed hundreds of complaints against officers. Do you know how many resulted in real consequences? Not many, I'm guessing. 11. Out of hundreds. And those 11 were only the cases so egregious we couldn't bury them." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup like she was cold, even though the shop was warm. "I didn't become a cop to be part of a cover-up machine. I wanted to help people. I wanted to hold bad officers accountable. But the system isn't designed for accountability. It's designed to protect itself. Why are you telling me this? Because you're the first person who's had the resources and knowledge to actually fight back. And because I have more information that you need to see." She slid a thumb drive across the table. "Detective Reeves isn't the only problem. He's just the most obvious one. There are others. And the supervisors know. They've always known." David looked at the thumb drive but didn't touch it yet. "If I use this information, they'll know it came from someone inside. They'll come after you, I know. But I can't keep being part of this. I can't keep writing reports that I know will be ignored. I can't keep watching officers violate people's rights and get away with it." Her voice cracked slightly. "Last month, I had to tell a single mother that the complaint against the officers who broke her door down was unfounded. I looked her in the eyes and lied to her. I can't do that anymore." David picked up the thumb drive. "Thank you. This takes courage. Courage is what you're doing, Professor. I'm just trying to live with myself." The information on Vanessa's thumb drive was devastating. It contained complete internal affairs files on Detective Reeves and 5 other officers, showing a clear pattern of complaints being minimized or dismissed. It had emails from supervisors instructing investigators to find alternative explanations for questionable searches. It had recordings of internal review hearings where officers gave contradictory statements that nobody challenged. Lisa spent an entire weekend going through it all. When she called David on Monday morning, she sounded exhausted but energized. "We have them. We have everything. This isn't just about Detective Reeves anymore. We can show systematic failure at every level of oversight. The department didn't just fail to stop these violations. They actively covered them up." The next phase of David's lawsuit expanded dramatically. They added the police chief as a defendant, arguing he failed in his supervisory duties. They added 3 supervisors who had direct knowledge of the complaints and did nothing. They added the city's internal affairs division for failing to properly investigate. The police union went into full defensive mode. Their president, a 20-year veteran named Jack Morrison, held almost daily press conferences attacking David personally. He called him a radical professor pushing an anti-police agenda. He claimed David was trying to make it impossible for officers to protect the community. He said the lawsuit would destroy police morale and make the city less safe. The attacks got personal. Someone leaked David's salary as a university professor, trying to paint him as an out-of-touch elitist. Anonymous social media accounts started posting his address and his wife's workplace. One evening, David came home to find his front tire slashed and a note on his windshield that just said, "Back off." Jennifer found him standing in the driveway staring at the note. "We need to talk," she said quietly. They went inside. Rachel and Tyler were doing homework upstairs. Jennifer sat David down at the kitchen table and took his hands. "I'm scared," she said. "Not just for us, but for the kids. Someone knows where we live. Someone's threatening us. Is this worth putting our family at risk?" David wanted to say yes immediately, but he stopped himself. This was a fair question, and Jennifer deserved a real answer, not a reflexive one. "I don't know," he admitted. "A month ago I would have said, of course it's worth it. Fighting for civil rights is always worth it. But that was before someone slashed our tire. Before people started posting your workplace online. Before our kids started getting nervous whenever they see a police car. So what do we do?" David was quiet for a long moment. "We can stop. I can take the settlement. We can move on with our lives. The city would probably agree to a much bigger payout now that things have gotten this messy. We could use that money to send the kids to any college they want. We could take that vacation you've been wanting to take. We could pretend none of this happened. But you don't want to do that." "No, I don't, but I also don't want to put you and the kids in danger for my principles." Jennifer looked at him with an expression he'd seen countless times over their 20 years of marriage. It was the look she got when she was about to say something she'd thought through carefully. When we got married, you were working 80-hour weeks at the Civil Rights Organization, making almost nothing, fighting cases that everyone said you couldn't win. I knew who you were then. I knew what mattered to you, and I loved you for it. She squeezed his hands. That hasn't changed. Yes, I'm scared. Yes, this is hard, but if you walk away now, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. And the people who are threatening us will learn that intimidation works. Are you sure? No, I'm terrified, but I'm sure that I didn't marry someone who backs down when things get hard. The next day, David held a press conference of his own. He stood outside the courthouse with Lisa beside him, Jennifer slightly behind him showing her support, and he addressed the cameras directly. There have been attempts to intimidate me and my family into dropping this lawsuit. I want to be very clear, they won't work. This case is not about me personally. It's about a pattern of constitutional violations that has harmed dozens, maybe hundreds of people in this city. It's about a system that protects bad officers instead of holding them accountable. And it's about making sure that what happened to my family doesn't keep happening to others. A reporter shouted a question. Are you saying the police are threatening you? I'm saying someone is trying to intimidate me into silence. I'll let others draw their own conclusions about who might benefit from that. The police union denied any involvement in the threats, of course. But the damage was done. Now the story wasn't just about bad searches. It was about intimidation and cover-ups in a department that seemed more interested in protecting itself than serving the community. The Justice Department investigation accelerated. Federal agents started interviewing officers, supervisors, and victims. The local FBI field office opened its own inquiry into whether civil rights violations had been committed under color of law, which is a federal crime. Detective Reeves, facing mounting pressure and the likelihood of criminal charges, did something unexpected. He requested a meeting with the prosecutor handling the investigation. Through his lawyer, he indicated he might be willing to cooperate in exchange for a plea deal. David learned about this from a prosecutor friend who called him one evening. Reeves is going to flip. He's going to testify about the culture in the department, about how supervisors encouraged aggressive tactics, about how they were taught to justify searches after the fact. Why would he do that? Because he's looking at potential federal prison time and he wants to minimize it. He's going to try to argue he was just following the culture and training he was given. He'll throw his supervisors under the bus to save himself. David felt a strange mix of satisfaction and disgust. Reeves was the one who'd broken down his door, who'd dismissed his rights with a wave and a smirk. And now he was going to cooperate to save his own skin. But if it meant more accountability, more truth coming out, David would take it. The city was starting to crack under the pressure. Mayor Thornton called an emergency meeting with city council members. The Justice Department had made it clear that if the city didn't implement major reforms voluntarily, they would seek a consent decree, which would put the entire police department under federal oversight for years. That would be expensive, embarrassing, and politically devastating. The mayor knew she had one option left. She needed to settle David's lawsuit, but not quietly. She needed a settlement that showed real commitment to change. That included reforms significant enough to satisfy the community and maybe head off federal intervention. Her office reached out to Lisa with a new proposal. The city was ready to talk about real change. Not just money, real systemic reform. David sat in Lisa's office reading the preliminary proposal. It was different from the earlier settlement offers. Very different. They're serious this time, Lisa said. The mayor knows this is her only way out. David kept reading. The proposal included money, yes, but it also included mandatory body cameras, policy changes, civilian oversight with real authority, and a complete overhaul of the internal affairs process. It was everything he'd been fighting for. But he couldn't help wondering, was it enough? And more importantly, would they actually follow through once the spotlight moved on? I want to think about it, David said. And I want to talk to Gregory and Patricia. They're part of this now, too. Outside Lisa's office window, the city was going about its normal business. People walking to work, cars stuck in traffic, construction crews repairing roads. Normal life continuing while everything was changing underneath. David wondered if those people knew how close they'd come to real change, or how easily it could all still slip away if they weren't careful. 6 months after the raid that changed everything, David stood in a conference room at City Hall with Lisa. Gregory, Patricia, and a dozen city officials. Outside, reporters waited for news. Inside, they were finalizing a settlement that would reshape how the police department operated. The final agreement was nothing like the early offers the city had made. It wasn't just a check and a confidentiality agreement. It was a blueprint for change. David received $2.3 million in damages. Gregory and Patricia each received settlements as well, though smaller. But none of them were there for the money. They were there for what came next. The city agreed to equip every police officer with body cameras that couldn't be turned off during interactions with the public. Any officer who deliberately disabled or obscured their camera would face automatic suspension. The footage would be stored independently and made available to anyone filing a complaint. They agreed to create a civilian oversight board with real power, not just an advisory role. This board would have the authority to investigate complaints, subpoena documents, and recommend discipline. It would include community members, legal experts, and retired judges. Detective Reeves's cases would never have been buried if this board had existed. All officers would undergo mandatory constitutional rights training every year, with a special focus on Fourth Amendment protections. David himself agreed to help develop the curriculum and teach some of the sessions. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same officers who dismissed his expertise would now learn from him. The department's policy on searches was completely rewritten. Anonymous tips alone would never again justify a raid without corroboration. Officers would need to document their probable cause in detail before any judge would sign off on a warrant. And no-knock raids would require approval from the police chief and city attorney. Perhaps most importantly, the Internal Affairs Division would be restructured and staffed with investigators from outside the department, people who didn't have loyalties to the officers they were investigating. Mayor Thornton signed the agreement with cameras rolling. She looked tired. The scandal had aged her. Her re-election campaign was struggling, but to her credit, she was doing the right thing now, even if it had taken federal pressure and public outrage to get her there. This settlement represents a commitment to constitutional policing and community trust, she said at the press conference. We failed. We allowed a culture to develop where shortcuts were taken and rights were violated. That ends today. David spoke briefly at the same press conference. He kept his comments short and focused. This settlement isn't a victory. It's a beginning. Real change doesn't happen because of one lawsuit or one settlement agreement. It happens because communities demand accountability every single day. It happens because people refuse to accept injustice as normal. What happened to me should never happen to anyone. Now we have tools to help prevent it. But tools are only useful if people use them. Detective Reeves never went to trial. He pleaded guilty to 2 federal charges of violating civil rights under color of law. The judge sentenced him to 18 months in federal prison and permanent removal from law enforcement. 2 of his supervisors were fired. The police chief resigned under pressure, though he maintained he'd done nothing wrong. 3 other officers from Reeves's unit were suspended pending investigation. Vanessa Wright, the internal affairs investigator who'd provided David with crucial evidence, was quietly transferred to a different department. She'd been right to worry about retaliation, but the city was under too much scrutiny to fire her outright. The police union president, Jack Morrison, retired earlier than planned. The union itself underwent leadership changes, with younger officers pushing for a different approach to accountability. But David knew the real test would come in the months and years ahead. When the spotlight moved on and the pressure eased, would the reforms actually be implemented? Would the oversight board have real independence? Would officers change their behavior or just find new ways to cut corners? He decided to stay involved. He couldn't walk away now. With a portion of his settlement money, David established a legal defense fund for low-income residents who experienced police misconduct. He partnered with local civil rights organizations to ensure that people who couldn't afford lawyers would still have someone to fight for them. He started teaching a free community workshop on constitutional rights every month. The first session drew 12 people. By the 6th month, they had to move to a larger venue to accommodate nearly 100 attendees. People wanted to know their rights. They wanted to know what to do if police showed up without a warrant. They wanted to know how to file complaints and what recourse they had. David brought in guest speakers, police officers who supported reform, public defenders who dealt with bad searches every day, and victims who'd successfully challenged misconduct. The workshops became more than just legal education. They became a space where the community could have honest conversations about policing and safety and justice. Jennifer surprised him by becoming involved too. The trauma of the raid had been real, and she'd struggled with anxiety for months afterward. She'd started seeing a therapist, which helped, but she also realized she wasn't alone in those feelings. She began speaking at community forums about the psychological impact of police misconduct on families. She talked about what it felt like to wake up to officers breaking down your door. She talked about how her children had nightmares afterward, how they'd freeze every time they saw a police car. She talked about the long process of feeling safe in your own home again. Her honesty resonated with people. Other families reached out, sharing their own experiences. Some had been through similar raids. Others had loved ones who'd been mistreated during arrests. They all carried trauma that rarely got acknowledged or addressed. Jennifer started a support group that met twice a month. It wasn't therapy exactly. It was just a space where people could talk about their experiences without judgment, where they could process their feelings and realize they weren't alone. Rachel and Tyler, David's teenage children, processed everything in their own ways. Rachel wrote a powerful essay for her school newspaper about civil rights and police accountability. Some of her classmates' parents complained, saying it was inappropriate and anti-police. The school stood by her right to express her views. Tyler became interested in criminal justice reform. He started researching how other cities handled police oversight. He interviewed police officers, activists, and victims for a documentary project. At 16 years old, he was already thinking about how to make systems better. A year after the settlement, the Civilian Oversight Board released its first annual report. It documented 37 complaints investigated, 12 sustained violations, and 8 officers disciplined. It wasn't perfect, but it was more accountability than the old system had produced in a decade. Body camera footage had already been used in 3 cases to exonerate officers falsely accused of misconduct, and in 2 cases to prove misconduct that officers had denied. The cameras were working exactly as intended, protecting good officers and exposing bad ones. David was invited to speak at a national conference on police reform. He stood on stage in front of hundreds of law enforcement officials, activists, lawyers, and community leaders, and he told his story. But more importantly, he emphasized what came after. Getting raided was traumatic. Fighting back was exhausting. Winning the settlement was gratifying. But none of that matters if nothing actually changes, he said. Real reform requires constant attention. It requires community involvement. It requires good officers to speak up against bad practices. It requires elected officials to prioritize rights over convenience. And it requires all of us to remember that police work for the community, not the other way around. He paused, looking out at the audience. I was lucky. I had the knowledge and resources to fight back. Most people don't. That's why systemic change matters so much. We can't rely on every victim being a constitutional law professor. We need systems that protect everyone's rights automatically, not just when someone knows how to fight for them. The applause was long and genuine. 3 years after the raid, David received a letter from a young man named Chris. It took him a moment to place the name, then he remembered. Chris had been one of his students, the one who'd asked if anything would actually change. The letter explained that Chris had just graduated from law school. He'd decided not to become a prosecutor after all. Instead, he was joining a civil rights law firm. He credited David's case with showing him that individuals could make a difference. That fighting for justice wasn't just idealistic, it was necessary. David put the letter in a frame on his office wall, right next to a photo of his family taken a few months after the settlement. They were smiling, genuinely happy, standing in front of their house with a new door that nobody had broken down. The house felt like home again. It had taken time, but they'd reclaimed it, just like they'd helped reclaim constitutional rights for their community. Jennifer came into his office and saw him looking at the framed letter. "Another one?" she asked. He'd received dozens of letters over the years from people saying his case had inspired them or helped them. "Yeah, a former student. He's going to be a civil rights attorney." She smiled and wrapped her arms around him from behind. "You know what I realized the other day? I'm not angry anymore about what happened. I'm angry at what they did. But I'm not angry that it happened to us. Does that make sense? I think so. We were in a position to fight back. And because we did, Other people have protections they didn't have before. Our kids got to see what it means to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. That matters. David turned to face her. It was hard on you. On all of you. It was. But we got through it. And we made a difference. How many people can say that? That evening, David drove through the city on his way home from the university. He passed the police station, saw officers coming and going with body cameras visible on their uniforms. He drove through neighborhoods where people had attended his workshops, where they'd learned their rights and how to protect them. The city wasn't perfect. The police department still had problems. There were still complaints, still violations, still work to be done. Change was slow and incomplete and frustrating, but it was happening. Real people had real tools now to hold power accountable, and that, David thought, was worth everything they'd been through. He pulled into his driveway, walked up to his front door, the one that nobody had broken down in 3 years, and went inside to have dinner with his family. Justice, he'd learned, wasn't a destination you reached. It was a direction you kept walking in, one step at a time for as long as it took.